Chapter 7, The Road to Revolution. By 1763, Britain had amassed an enormous empire as a result of its victory over France. George Grenville, now the Prime Minister, believed that he had to extract as much money as possible out of the colonies. He helped guide through Parliament the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Quartering Act of 1765. He also pushed through a tax on stamps, the Stamp Act. This required that the use of any kind of paper for any kind of document, you had to pay a tax on it. The colonists were very upset by this, and the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 brought together delegates from 9 colonies. Merchants agreeing to non-importation, and the whole idea was to hurt Britain where it would hurt the most, in their pocketbooks. The Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty took things into their own hands by enforcing this non-importation agreement. The Stamp Act was repealed a year later, and Parliament quietly passed the Declaratory Act, saying that it basically had the right to do anything it wanted to the colonies. Things were quiet for a while, but not for long. A variety of taxes were placed on glass and lead and paper and paint in the Townshend Acts. By 1767, Lord Grenville had been replaced by Lord Townshend. What hadn't been replaced was Britain's desire to raise money from the colonies. A variety of light taxes were put on things like glass, paper, lead, and tea. Unfortunately, when you have a mother country with a military presence in its colonies, problems will ensue. On March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. Boston townspeople, 60 or so, surrounded 10 very young, very frightened, very edgy soldiers, and the Redcoats opened fire on civilians, killing or wounding 11 of them. The British economy was fragile because of its newfound status as a global empire. One thing the British economy could not tolerate was any sort of problems involving the British East India Company, a massive commercial venture. The company had a huge overabundance of tea that it had failed to sell. Britain decided that the colonies would be a perfect and exclusive outlet for this tea and would try and build up the company that was faltering. Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts forced citizens to allow ships bearing that tea into the Boston harbor. On the night of December 16, 1773, Bostonians disguised themselves as Indians, got aboard the ships, and dumped the tea into the harbor. This was the Boston Tea Party. Parliament quickly moved to punish and isolate Massachusetts. In 1774, they passed a series of measures called the Intolerable Acts. They restricted town meetings. They forced officials who killed colonists in the line of duty to be sent to Britain for trial, not trusting the colonial court system. They closed the port of Boston. The Quebec Act of 1774, which permitted Catholic French Canadians to freely practice their religion. It also restored French civil law in that part of the New World. In response, the First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. And the idea was to address their grievances over the Intolerable Acts. The Continental Congress talked about a lot of things. They drew up papers, the Declaration of Rights. They drew up or created the Association, in which a complete boycott of British goods was called for. Also, military preparations were taking place. Artillery was starting to be collected as well as ammunition. In April of 1775, a regiment of British soldiers was sent out to Lexington. The idea was to seize provisions of gunpowder and destroy it. At Lexington, 8 Americans were shot and killed. This was known as the Lexington Massacre. British forces moved on to Concord, and the idea was to do the same thing. Here, they met with American resistance. On the march back to Boston, they had to go through a corridor of hostile colonist or patriot soldiers. There were 300 casualties and 70 deaths. Because of this, Britain had a war rather than a rebellion on their hands. 2 crucial factors helped the Patriot Army to survive long enough to get into the fight. First of all, George Washington and his men survived no food and bitter winter conditions at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Secondly, foreign commanders helped to prepare and train and support Patriot fighters. Included in this would be the Marquis de Lafayette, a Frenchman invaluable to helping, and Baron von Steuben, a German who helped whip American forces into shape and prepare them to fight the British.